Jake Martinez stood in the doorway of his small auto repair shop, watching the last customer of the day drive away in their newly fixed Honda. The sun was setting behind the old buildings on Main Street, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. It should have been a beautiful sight, but all Jake could think about was the envelope sitting on his desk inside, the one with final notice stamped in red letters across the front. He walked back into his shop, the familiar smell of motor oil and old metal greeting him like an old friend. This place had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Martinez men had fixed cars and trucks in this same spot, helping their neighbors get back on the road. But now it looked like Jake might be the last one. The shop was small, maybe 30 feet by 40 feet, with 2 car bays and tools that had seen better days. Some of the wrenches were older than Jake himself, passed down from his father when he died 5 years ago. The air compressor wheezed when it worked, and the hydraulic lift in Bay 2 made a grinding sound that worried Jake every time he used it. He kept telling himself he'd fix it when business picked up, but business never seemed to pick up anymore. Jake pulled the envelope from his desk and read the notice again, even though he had memorized every word. 3 months behind on rent. Pay in full by Friday or face eviction. The amount at the bottom might as well have been $1 million for all the chance Jake had of coming up with it. He had exactly $43 in his checking account, and a jar of quarters on his kitchen counter. That might add up to another $20. The big chain shops on the other side of town were taking most of his customers. They had newer equipment, fancy computer diagnostic tools, and could order parts same day. Jake still did most of his diagnostic work by listening to engines and feeling for problems with his hands, the way his father had taught him. It worked just fine. But people wanted flashing lights and printouts these days. They wanted to feel like they were getting something modern for their money. He folded the notice and stuffed it back in the envelope. Tomorrow he'd have to make some phone calls, maybe see if his cousin Roberto could lend him something. Roberto owned a landscaping business and was doing okay, but Jake hated asking for help. He'd been taking care of himself since he was 18, and the idea of admitting he was failing made his stomach twist. Jake grabbed his keys from the workbench and started turning off the lights. The fluorescent bulbs flickered as they went dark, another thing that needed fixing around here. He locked up the shop and walked to his old Ford pickup truck, a 1998 model that he'd bought from a customer who couldn't pay their bill. The paint was faded and there was a dent in the passenger side door, but the engine ran smooth. Jake made sure of that. The drive home took him through the newer part of town first, past the shopping centers and chain restaurants that had sprung up over the last 10 years. Then he headed into the older neighborhoods where he'd grown up, and finally out into the rural areas where houses sat on bigger lots, and people still had space to breathe. Jake lived in a small apartment above Mrs. Chen's garage, paying rent that was way below market rate because he'd fixed her late husband's classic Mustang for free a few years back. The road wound through rolling hills dotted with farms and vineyards. This was California wine country, though not the fancy part that tourists visited. These were working farms where real people grew grapes and raised cattle, and tried to make a living from the land. Jake had always loved this drive, especially in the evening when the light was soft and everything looked peaceful. That's when he saw her. A young woman was kneeling beside an old water pump near what looked like a small farm. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore simple jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days. Her small sedan sat nearby with the hood up, steam rising from the engine. Even from a distance, Jake could see the frustration in her body language as she stood up and put her hands on her hips, staring at the broken pump like she was trying to will it back to life. Jake slowed his truck and pulled over to the shoulder. His first instinct was always to help when he saw someone having car trouble, but lately he'd been hesitating more. Time was money, and he had precious little of either. But something about the scene in front of him made him forget about his own problems for a moment. The woman looked young, maybe in her 20s, and she was clearly in trouble. He got out of his truck and walked across the dusty ground toward her. As he got closer, he could see that she'd been crying. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, and her hands were dirty from trying to work on the pump herself. "Excuse me," Jake called out, not wanting to startle her. "Looks like you might need some help." The woman looked up at him, and Jake was struck by how tired she looked. Not just physically tired, but emotionally drained, like someone who had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "My irrigation pump died," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And now my car won't start either. I don't know what I'm going to do." Jake looked around at the vineyard stretching out behind her. The grapevines looked healthy but thirsty, their leaves starting to droop in the evening heat. Without water, they wouldn't last long in this California sun. "Let me take a look," Jake said, already walking toward the pump. He didn't even think about it. His father had taught him that when you see someone in trouble, you help. It's that simple. You don't ask what's in it for you, and you don't worry about whether you have time. You just help. The pump was old, probably installed 20 years ago or more. Jake knelt down beside it and started tracing the electrical connections with his eyes. It didn't take long to spot the problem. The main relay had burned out, and without it, the pump was just a hunk of metal. "What's your name?" he asked, looking up at the woman. "Maria," she said quietly. "Well, Maria, I'm Jake, and I think I can fix this for you." Jake knelt beside the broken pump, running his hands over the metal casing like a doctor examining a patient. The relay box was hot to the touch, which told him everything he needed to know. He'd seen this same problem dozens of times over the years, cheap relays that couldn't handle the constant on-off cycling, especially in the summer heat. "How long has it been acting up?" he asked Maria, who was standing behind him wringing her hands. "About a week," she said. "It would start making this clicking sound, then just stop working for a while." "Today it stopped completely," Jake nodded. That was exactly what he expected to hear. The relay had been dying slowly, clicking as it tried to make connection until finally it gave up completely. He looked around and spotted his truck parked on the road, then back at the pump. This was going to take some work. "I think I can help you," he said, standing up and brushing the dirt off his knees. "But I'll need to get some tools from my truck, and maybe see if I've got a relay that'll work." Maria's eyes lit up with hope for the first time since he'd arrived. "Really? You think you can fix it?" "I won't know for sure until I try," Jake said honestly. "But I've seen this problem before. Let me grab my toolbox." He walked back to his truck, his mind already running through what he'd need. The relay was the obvious problem, but he wanted to check the whole electrical system to make sure there wasn't something else going wrong. Pumps like this were workhorses, but they needed regular maintenance that most people didn't think about. Jake opened the metal toolbox in the back of his truck, the same one his father had used for 40 years. The tools inside were old but well cared for, each one in its proper place. He grabbed his electrical tester, a few different-sized screwdrivers, and his wire strippers. Then he remembered the small box of relays he kept for emergencies. Most mechanics would charge $50 for a service call plus parts, but Jake had learned a long time ago that sometimes helping people was more important than making money. When he got back to the pump, Maria was sitting on the ground beside it with her head in her hands. She looked so defeated that Jake felt his chest tighten. He'd been in that exact same position many times lately, staring at problems that seemed too big to solve. "Hey," he said gently, setting his tools down. "Don't give up yet. Let me see what I can do." He opened the relay box and confirmed what he'd suspected. The main relay was burned black around the contacts, definitely beyond repair. But the wiring looked good and the connections were solid. This was going to be a straightforward fix if he had the right replacement part. "You said this has been your irrigation system for a while?" Jake asked as he worked, partly to keep Maria's spirits up and partly because he was genuinely curious. "My grandfather installed it about 15 years ago," she said. "He taught me how to maintain the basic stuff, but I don't know anything about the electrical parts." Jake smiled. "Your grandfather sounds like a smart man. This is good equipment, just needs a little attention sometimes." He pulled the burned relay out and held it up to the fading light, checking the part number stamped on the side. Then he went through his box of spare parts, hoping he'd have something that would work. Luck was with him. He had a relay with the same specifications, probably pulled from another pump job months ago. "Got it," he said, holding up the new relay. "This should do the trick." Installing the new relay only took a few minutes, but Jake didn't stop there. He spent the next hour checking every connection, cleaning corrosion from the terminals and testing the pump motor itself. His father had always told him that if you're going to fix something, fix it right the first time. Don't just patch the obvious problem and walk away. Maria watched him work, asking occasional questions about what he was doing. Jake found himself explaining things in detail, the way his father had explained them to him when he was young. There was something peaceful about working with his hands while the sun set behind the hills, even though his own problems were still waiting for him back home. "The motor sounds good," he said, listening to the pump run through its cycle. "But you should probably have someone check the pressure switch in a few months. It's not bad yet, but I can hear it starting to stick." "How much do I owe you?" Maria asked, reaching into her pocket. Jake was already shaking his head before she finished the question. "Nothing. Don't worry about it." "But your time and the part," she protested, pulling out a small roll of bills that couldn't have been more than $30. "Keep it," Jake said firmly. "You need it more than I do." That wasn't exactly true. Jake needed every dollar he could get, and $30 would buy groceries for a few days. But looking at Maria, seeing the relief on her face as the pump worked perfectly, he knew he was making the right choice. His father would have done the same thing. "I don't know how to thank you," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. "You probably saved my entire crop." Jake was packing up his tools, but he paused to look at the vineyard stretching out behind them. In the dim light, he could see row after row of grapevines, all depending on this one pump for water. He'd grown up around farms and knew how quickly things could go wrong when equipment failed. "What kind of grapes?" he asked. "Mostly Cabernet Sauvignon with some Merlot on the south side," Maria said. "It's not a huge operation, but it's all I have." Jake nodded. Wine grapes were finicky, especially during the hot summer months. Without irrigation, Maria could have lost everything she'd worked for. He handed her a business card from his shirt pocket, one of the plain white ones he'd printed at the office supply store. "If you have any more trouble with this pump or anything else mechanical, give me a call. My shop's just 20 minutes from here." Maria took the card and read it carefully. "Martinez Auto Repair. Thank you, Jake. Really." As Jake drove home that night, his headlights cutting through the darkness on the winding country road, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was close. For 3 hours, he'd forgotten about his own problems and focused on helping someone else. And seeing the relief on Maria's face when that pump kicked back to life had been worth more than the $30 she'd tried to pay him. His apartment was dark when he arrived. The power still shut off from the unpaid bill. But for the first time in weeks, Jake fell asleep easily, not thinking about eviction notices or failing businesses, but about the simple satisfaction of fixing something that was broken. 2 weeks after fixing Maria's irrigation pump, Jake found himself thinking about her more often than he expected, not in a romantic way exactly, but more like wondering how her grape crop was doing and whether that old pump was still running properly. He'd driven past her farm a few times on his way home, always slowing down just a little to see if everything looked okay from the road. Then, on a Thursday morning when Jake had no customers and too much time to worry about his mounting bills, his phone rang. "Hello, is this Jake from Martinez Auto Repair?" The voice was familiar, though he couldn't place it at first. "Yeah, this is Jake." "It's Maria. You helped me with my irrigation pump a couple weeks ago. I'm really sorry to bother you, but I'm having trouble with my tractor now, and I didn't know who else to call." Jake was already reaching for his keys before she finished talking. "What kind of trouble?" "It starts fine, but when I try to use the mower attachment, the whole engine just dies. I've got about 10 acres that need cutting before the weekend, and..." Her voice trailed off, sounding frustrated and a little embarrassed. "I'll be right there," Jake said. "Give me 20 minutes. The drive to Maria's farm felt shorter this time, maybe because he was looking forward to seeing her again. When he pulled up to the property, he found her sitting on an old red Massey Ferguson tractor that had definitely seen better days. The paint was faded and there were patches of rust around the wheel wells, but Jake could tell it had been well maintained despite its age. "Sorry to call you again," Maria said as he approached. "I know you're busy." Jake almost laughed at that. Busy was the last thing he was these days. "Don't worry about it. Let me take a look." He spent the next hour diagnosing the problem, with Maria watching and asking questions about how everything worked. The issue turned out to be a clogged fuel filter that was restricting flow when the engine was under load. A simple fix, but one that could have left Maria with uncut grass and potential fire hazards if the dry vegetation got too high. "Your grandfather teach you to work on this too?" Jake asked as he installed the new filter. Maria shook her head. "He tried, but I was more interested in the growing side of things back then. I wish I'd paid more attention to the mechanical stuff." "It's never too late to learn," Jake said. "Here, let me show you how to check this filter yourself." He guided her through the process, showing her where the filter was located and how to tell when it needed changing. Maria was a quick learner, asking smart questions and actually getting her hands dirty as she practiced removing and reinstalling the part. "You're a natural at this," Jake said, and he meant it. Most people are afraid to touch anything mechanical. I guess when it's your livelihood on the line, you learn to be brave, Maria said with a small smile. They got the mower attachment working perfectly, and Jake followed Maria around the property as she cut the grass between the vineyard rows. The late afternoon sun was warm on his shoulders, and there was something peaceful about watching the neat rows of grapevines pass by. Maria worked methodically, taking care not to get too close to the vines themselves. "How long have you been running this place?" Jake asked when they stopped for a water break. "About 3 years now," Maria said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "It's been a learning experience, that's for sure." Jake noticed she didn't talk much about her past, and he didn't push. Everyone had their reasons for keeping certain things private. He understood that better than most people. When they finished the mowing, Maria insisted on making Jake a sandwich before he left. Her kitchen was small but cozy, with herbs growing in pots on the windowsill and the smell of something delicious simmering on the stove. "I made too much soup yesterday," she said, ladling a generous portion into a container. "Please take some home with you." Jake accepted the food gratefully. He'd been living mostly on canned soup and instant noodles lately, so a home-cooked meal sounded amazing. "You don't have to do this." "It's the least I can do," Maria said. "You've saved me twice now." That became the pattern over the next few weeks. Every time something mechanical broke down on Maria's farm, and old equipment always seemed to have something going wrong, she would call Jake. Sometimes it was the irrigation system acting up again. Other times it was the old truck she used for hauling supplies, or the generator that powered her water well when the electricity was unreliable. Jake found himself looking forward to these calls. Not just because they gave him something to do when his shop was empty, but because Maria was easy to be around. She worked hard, never complained, and always treated him like he was doing her a huge favor even when the repairs were simple. She also fed him, which was becoming more important as his own financial situation got worse. The final eviction notice came on a Monday morning. Jake stared at the paper in his hands, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. 30 days to pay everything he owed or lose the shop. The amount might as well have been $1 million. That same day, his biggest remaining customer, old Mr. Peterson, who brought in his fleet of work trucks every month, called to say he was switching to the new chain shop across town. They had offered him a fleet discount that Jake simply couldn't match. "Nothing personal, son," Mr. Peterson said over the phone. "I know your daddy and he was good people, but business is business." Jake sat in his empty shop that afternoon, surrounded by 3 generations of tools and memories, wondering if this was really the end. His phone had been silent all day except for that one devastating call. No customers, no prospects, no hope. Then, just as he was getting ready to close up and drive home to his dark apartment, his phone rang. "Jake, it's Maria. I hate to bother you again, but my truck is making this weird grinding noise and I'm supposed to pick up a delivery tomorrow morning. Do you think you could take a look?" "I'll be right there," Jake said, surprised by how much lighter he felt just hearing her voice. As he drove out to Maria's farm, Jake realized that helping her had become the best part of his week. It reminded him why he'd become a mechanic in the first place, not for the money but for the satisfaction of fixing things and helping people. Even if everything else was falling apart, at least he could still do that. The sun was setting behind the hills as he pulled into Maria's driveway, painting the vineyard in shades of gold and purple. Whatever happened with his shop, whatever happened next, he was glad he had this. Sometimes the smallest connections could keep you going when everything else seemed lost. The sheriff's deputy looked uncomfortable as he handed Jake the papers. "I'm real sorry about this, son. I knew your dad. He was a good man." Jake took the eviction notice with hands that barely shook anymore. After weeks of dreading this moment, it almost felt like relief to have it finally happen. "Thanks, Deputy Rodriguez. I know you're just doing your job." "You got until Friday to clear out," the deputy said. After that, the landlord's changing the locks. Jake nodded and watched the patrol car pull away from his shop. Friday. 3 days to pack up 40 years of family history and figure out what came next. He looked around the garage at his father's tools, his grandfather's workbench, the faded photographs of classic cars they'd restored over the decades. How do you fit a lifetime into cardboard boxes? His phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment his heart jumped, thinking maybe it was a customer. but it was just the electric company reminding him about his past due balance. Jake deleted the message without reading all of it. That evening, he drove out to Maria's farm one last time. He hadn't told her about the eviction yet, but he figured he should let her know he'd probably be leaving town soon. Maybe moving back to Sacramento where his cousin Roberto lived. Try to find work at one of the big shops there. The thought made his stomach turn, but staying here without the shop didn't make much sense. Maria was watering the grapevines by hand when he arrived, using a long hose connected to the pump he'd fixed weeks earlier. The evening light made everything look golden and peaceful, like something from a postcard. "Hey, Jake," she called out, turning off the water. "I wasn't expecting you today. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about something." She must have heard something in his voice because her expression grew serious. "Is everything okay?" Jake found himself struggling to find the words. How do you tell someone who's become a good friend that you're basically giving up on everything you've worked for? "I'm probably going to have to leave town soon." "The shop?" "Well, things aren't working out." Maria was quiet for a long moment, coiling up the hose in neat loops. "I'm sorry. Jake, I know how much that place means to you." "Yeah, well, sometimes things just don't work out the way you plan." He tried to keep his voice light, but it came out flat and tired instead. "Can I ask you something?" Maria said suddenly. "Would you meet me here tomorrow morning? Early, maybe around 7? There's something I need to show you." Jake looked at her curiously. "Sure, I guess." "What's going on?" "Just trust me, okay? It's important." There was something different in her voice, something Jake couldn't quite identify. Nervous, maybe, or excited. Either way, he agreed to meet her. It wasn't like he had anywhere else to be. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about packing up the shop, about saying goodbye to the only life he'd ever known. Around midnight, he got up and made a list of everything he needed to do before Friday. Call the utility companies, arrange for a moving truck, figure out what to do with tools that wouldn't fit in his pickup. The list felt endless. The next morning, Jake arrived at Maria's farm a few minutes early. But instead of driving to her house like usual, he noticed her standing by the road, waving him in a different direction. "Follow me," she called out, getting into her old sedan. "We're going to a different part of the property." Jake followed her car down a dirt road he'd never noticed before, winding through hills covered in grapevines. The road went on much longer than he expected, climbing up and over a ridge before dropping down into a valley he didn't know existed, and that's when Jake saw the sign. Esperanza Estate Vineyards. It read in elegant gold letters on a dark green background. "Established 1952, visitors welcome." Jake slowed his truck, staring at the sign. This had to be some kind of mistake. He was supposed to be following Maria to her small family farm, not to one of the most famous wineries in the entire region. Esperanza Estate was the kind of place that celebrities visited, where a single bottle of wine cost more than Jake made in a day. But Maria's car kept going, turning through an ornate iron gate that stood wide open. Jake hesitated for a moment, then followed her onto a paved road lined with perfect rows of grapevines stretching as far as he could see. The main building that came into view looked like something from a movie. It was a massive Spanish-style structure with red tile roofs and arched walkways, surrounded by manicured gardens and fountains. Tour buses were parked in a designated area, and Jake could see groups of people walking around with wine glasses taking pictures. Maria parked her car near a side entrance and got out, motioning for Jake to follow. She looked different somehow, more confident, like she belonged in this place in a way that Jake definitely didn't. "Maria," Jake said, climbing out of his truck. "What are we doing here? I think you made a wrong turn somewhere." She walked over to him, and Jake noticed she was carrying a set of keys in her hand. Not just any keys, but the kind of electronic key fob that opened expensive cars and buildings. "We didn't make a wrong turn," she said quietly.
"Jake, there's something I need to tell you."
"Something I should have told you weeks ago." Jake felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. "I don't understand." Maria took a deep breath. "My name isn't just Maria, it's Maria Esperanza Rodriguez. And this..." She gestured toward the sprawling vineyard around them. "This is my family's winery. All of it. 3,000 acres. Jake stared at her, his brain struggling to process what she was saying. "Your family's winery? But you..." "I mean, the place where I met you. That's the original property where my great-grandfather first planted grapes in 1952, Maria explained. "I've been working there for the past year, learning the business from the ground up. My father thought I should understand every part of the operation before I take over as the next generation. Take over? Jake's voice came out as barely a whisper. I'm the heir to all of this, Jake. When my father retires next year, I'll be running Esperanza Estate. But I wanted to work in the vineyard first, really understand what it takes to grow the grapes, before I got involved in the corporate side of things. Jake looked around at the massive operation, then back at Maria. The woman he thought was a struggling small farmer was actually worth millions, possibly tens of millions. The irrigation pump he'd fixed, the tractor he'd repaired, the simple meals she'd shared with him, all of it took on a completely different meaning. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Maria's eyes filled with tears. Because when you stopped to help me that first day, you didn't know who I was. You just saw someone who needed help and you helped. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Most people, when they find out who my family is, they change. They start treating me differently, like I'm some kind of prize instead of just a person. Jake sank down onto a nearby bench, his head spinning. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Maria said, sitting down beside him. But I do have something to ask you. Jake sat on the bench in stunned silence, watching groups of tourists walk through the manicured gardens with their wine glasses and cameras. His entire world had just been turned upside down, and he was struggling to make sense of it all. The woman he thought he'd been helping out of kindness was actually one of the wealthiest people in the county. What did you want to ask me? He finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria turned to face him, and Jake could see she was nervous. First, I need you to understand something. Over the past few months, watching you work, seeing how you handle problems and treat people, Jake, you're exactly the kind of person we need here. I don't understand. Esperanza Estate has 3,000 acres. Jake, we have irrigation systems throughout the entire property, dozens of pieces of farm equipment, delivery trucks, processing machinery, and a maintenance operation that currently costs us over $200,000 a year. Jake's eyes widened. He couldn't even imagine that much money being spent on mechanical work. Right now, we contract everything out to different companies, Maria continued. One company for electrical work, another for hydraulics, a third for engine repair. It's expensive, inefficient, and half the time they don't understand agricultural equipment the way someone like you does. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I want to offer you a partnership. You'd run all mechanical operations for Esperanza Estate. We'd help you set up a proper facility here on the property, with modern equipment and whatever tools you need. In exchange, you'd handle all our maintenance and repair work. Plus, we'd help you expand into serving other wineries in the region. Jake stared at her, certain he must have misunderstood. You want me to work here? Not work for us, Maria said firmly. Work with us. As a partner. This would be your operation, Jake, your business. We'd just be your biggest client. I don't have money for a partnership, Jake said quietly. I can barely keep my current shop open. You don't need money, Maria said. You have something much more valuable. You have integrity, skill, and a work ethic that money can't buy. We'd provide the startup costs, the facility, the equipment. You'd provide the expertise and run the operation. Jake felt dizzy. This was too much, too fast. 3 days ago, he was facing eviction and had no idea how he'd pay for groceries. Now Maria was talking about partnerships and operations worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why? He asked. Why would you do this for me? Maria smiled. The first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the revelation began. Because when my irrigation pump broke and my car wouldn't start, a stranger stopped to help me. He spent 3 hours fixing my problems and wouldn't take a penny for it. He gave me his business card and told me to call if I needed help again. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Jake's plain white business card, now wrinkled and worn from being carried around for months. I've called you at least a dozen times since then, she continued, and every single time you dropped whatever you were doing and came to help. You've never overcharged me, never tried to sell me things I didn't need, and half the time you wouldn't let me pay you at all. Do you know how rare that is in business? Jake looked down at his hands, rough and stained from years of working with tools. I just try to do the right thing. Exactly, Maria said. That's exactly why I want you as a partner. Not just because you're good at what you do, but because you're the kind of person who can be trusted. Over the next hour, Maria walked Jake through the entire estate, showing him the scope of what they were talking about. They had tractors that cost more than Jake's shop, irrigation systems that covered hundreds of acres, and processing equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. All of it needed regular maintenance and occasional repairs. The current setup isn't working, Maria explained as they walked through a massive equipment barn. When something breaks during harvest season, we can't wait 3 days for a contractor to show up. We need someone on site who understands our operation. Jake ran his hands over a massive John Deere tractor, the kind of machine he'd only seen in magazines. This is all incredible, Maria, but I need to think about it. Of course, she said. Take all the time you need. But Jake, there's something else I need to tell you. Jake looked at her, wondering what other surprises this day could possibly hold. These past few months, getting to know you, working alongside you. Maria paused, looking suddenly vulnerable. I think I'm falling in love with you. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. He'd been trying not to think about his growing feelings for Maria, knowing that getting involved with someone he was helping professionally could get complicated. Now finding out who she really was made everything even more complex. Maria, I know this is a lot, she said quickly. The business offer, my family situation, and now this. I'm not asking you to make any decisions about us right now, but I wanted you to know how I feel. That night, Jake sat in his dark apartment surrounded by half-packed boxes and his racing thoughts. Maria had offered him a ride into a completely different life, but part of him wondered if he was dreaming. People like him didn't get opportunities like this. There had to be a catch somewhere. But as he thought about the months he'd spent helping Maria, he realized something important. Every time he'd gone to her farm, every problem he'd solved, every repair he'd made, he'd done it because he wanted to help, not because he expected anything in return. The satisfaction he'd found in that work had been real, regardless of who Maria turned out to be. The next morning, Jake called Maria and asked if they could meet again. This time he had questions. Lots of them. They spent the entire day going over the business proposal in detail, talking about equipment needs, facility requirements, and what the partnership would actually look like day to day. What about your current shop? Maria asked. The landlord's already got someone else lined up to rent it, Jake said. I've got until tomorrow to clear out my tools. Bring them here, Maria said without hesitation. We'll set up a temporary workspace in the equipment barn until we can get your proper facility built. 6 months later, Jake stood in his new shop, a state-of-the-art facility that would have been beyond his wildest dreams a year earlier. Martinez Agricultural Services was painted in neat letters above the bay doors, and he had a waiting list of clients from vineyards throughout the region. But the best part wasn't the modern equipment or the steady income or even the beautiful facility. The best part was Maria, walking toward him with 2 cups of coffee and the smile that had first captured his attention months ago when she was just a woman with a broken pump who needed help. How's business? She asked, handing him the coffee. Jake looked around at his thriving operation, then at the woman who had become his partner in every sense of the word. Pretty good, he said, pulling her close. Pretty good. Sometimes he'd learned the best things in life start with the simplest decision, to help someone who needs it without expecting anything in return.